Hey folks, I'm Spencer, and on today's episode of Cult Mania we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be doing a little comparison between Dario Argento's horror classic Suspiria from 1977 and the 2018 remake by Luca Guadagnino. The first part of this review is going to be pretty spoiler free. We're going to compare the two films, but as I want this to be quite a deep dive, we're going to have to go into spoiler territory later on, but I'll put a big warning up there so that if you haven't seen the films, you don't have to worry. Now, I'm going to get this out of the way. The original Suspiria was, for the longest time, the film that I would always answer when people said, "What's your favourite film?" I've sort of given up on saying anything now because I can't pick. But it means that much to me, and for so long I was like, no one can remake it, it's never going to happen, no way. But then I saw the trailer for the remake and went, that looks very interesting. For those of you who don't know, Aregento's Suspiria was the first of his Three Mothers trilogy, which was where he started to deal with more supernatural themes rather than just crime and murder. It was written by Aregento himself and his then partner Dario Nicolodi, drawing on inspiration from the works of author Thomas de Quincey, but also taking into account stories that both of them were told as children. That's a point of contention because they both say that it's their family that came up with the original concept.
Susie.
The story centres around Susie Banyan, played by Jessica Harper. She's an American ballerina who travels to the Tanz Academy in Berlin to study. But on the night she arrives, she witnesses one of the other ballerinas running from the door screaming. And the next day when she arrives, she finds that that woman has been murdered, quite horrifically. It really is one of the best death sequences in any horror film. It soon becomes clear that something is very wrong at the academy and that Susie's going to have to find out what it is, or she'll almost certainly meet a grisly end too. The plot of Argento's film is pretty simplistic, but that's all it needs to be.
I just wanted to talk to you about some of the things that have been happening here lately.
That's because Argento's film is all about style. It's all about the cinematography and the score. It is pure cinema. Every frame of this film is a electrifying kaleidoscope of primary colours, something that Aregento demanded from the very start. Deep reds, chilling blues and ominous greens fill every inch of the screen. Argento's film takes as much inspiration from films like Powell and Pressburger's The Red Shoes as it does from something like Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace. I do really think if you can see a nice transfer of it, e.g. this one by Cult Films, it is still one of the best looking films you can ever see. And what you'll be seeing are some of the best horror set pieces ever committed to celluloid, especially for this era. I mean, while some of the effects are a little bit ropey by today's standards, the execution of them most certainly isn't. You are going to see some of the most fabulous deaths in horror with some of the best, tensest build-ups that you can get alongside them. The film is probably as famous for its soundtrack as it is for its gorgeous visuals. The soundtrack was composed by prog rock band Goblin, or The Goblins, as they are credited here. It's this amazing melding of synthesizers, guitar, just absolute wailing, literally just screaming, wailing sounds. It's amazing. It adds so much tension to the film, and more than tension actually, intensity. That might be in part because the score is so loud in this film. It is so high up in the mix, but it just helps that you've got these bold colours and this immensely loud soundtrack. It's just such an overwhelming experience in the best possible way. I think it is safe to say that Suspiria without this score is half of the film it currently is. Suspiria at its time was such a unique horror film, and to be honest, I think it still is. I mean, no one has managed to match the film style, Aregento included. And I think for so long that was why I just believed that remaking it was a complete waste of time. I'm not alone in thinking that remaking it was a waste of time. If you watch the commentary on this Cult Films edition, the commentary ends with Alan Jones and Kim Newman saying that making a remake is pointless. But who cares what people think? Hollywood studios usually don't, and we got our remake anyway. The remake was planned as early as the beginning of the 2000s, with the plan for it to be helmed by David Gordon Green. Natalie Portman was also supposed to take on the role of Susie Bannion, but this version of the film never went anywhere, and David Gordon Green would go on to direct 2018's Halloween in its place. I'm pretty glad about that because that film's great. It was in 2015 that Luca Guadagnino would take over the idea of directing. He had the script rewritten and went into production. 2018 Suspiria takes the basic framework of the original, but transforms Argento's fairy tale of sensory overload into a much slower film that is more about a feeling of accumulating dread than anything else. The plot begins similarly. This time Susie is played by Dakota Johnson, and similarly she arrives at the Tanz Academy wanting to be a dancer. But when she arrives this time, there is no outright bloody murder. It's just that one of the dancers has vanished. Guadagnino's Suspiria takes place in a real-world 1970s Berlin, a divided Berlin, as the film's opening title card says. The political turmoil of Berlin is internalised within this film's version of the Academy, which is something that Argento's film never even touches upon because it takes place in this bizarre fantasy world.
I don't know what you're talking about.
The remake wisely ditches all of the primary colours of the original. This Suspiria is cold. Greys and browns and greens fill the screen, and yet it's still beautiful because you just have this overwhelming sense of desolation. The film's shot in a 1:8:5 aspect ratio rather than the widescreen of the original, which helps to fill the frame with looks. It's all about faces and people, which is highlighted by the film's beautiful use of zooms. I mean, I love zooms anyway, but they really help draw you into the characters here, which is what this film's about. It's about people rather than spectacle. This film is no less intense, no less violent than the original. Again, it's just done in a different way. The violence here isn't shocking as much as it is disturbing and disgusting. It's body horror rather than slasher murder. I mean, this film will almost certainly stay in people's minds for one particularly graphic and horrific scene, which I'm not going to go into too much detail because it is a spectacle to be held. But every time I watch this film, it's still just, it just makes me wince. And without any CGI in that bit either, which is ridiculously impressive. The film's soundtrack could also be considered poles apart from its predecessor. This is a minimalist, krautrock inspired soundtrack that has lyrical songs. The soundtrack was actually written by Radiohead's Tom York, and I think he did a beautiful job, and I hope he does more film scores because it's just great. It really helps draw you into the mood of the film. Similar to the cinematography, York's score sort of perfectly balances the internal and the external, the beauty and the depression. I think it's also great because it's a nice through line to the original. Both scores are composed by people who produce rock albums rather than film scores. Suspiria 2018 has one thing that I think it's fair to say the original film lacks. and that's character. While Jessica Harper's Susie is a very likeable protagonist, she's pretty much the only real character in the film. Everyone else is just a shell or a caricature. That isn't necessarily a problem in the original because it doesn't need them, but it highlights more so what the remake brings to the table. Dakota Johnson is a brilliant Susie. She brings a great growth, she brings a character arc to what is in the original a simple heroine. Mia Goth is fantastic in this film as she's in anything. She plays Sarah and she brings a real warmth and kindness to a character who in the original is pretty boring. But to be honest, anyone else's work in Suspiria pales in comparison to the work that Tilda Swinton did in this film. She's incredibly magnetic as Madame Blanc, the main teacher within the school, but none of that compares to the work that she does in bringing so much empathy to the major male character in the film. She is heaped under so much makeup when she plays Dr. Klemperer, and yet you would never know. She just nails the performance so much, and the prosthetics are so good that I've seen it 3 times, I just stop thinking that it's Tilda Swinton under there. You just go that it is Lutz Eberdorf, the mock character they came up with. Suspiria 2018 deserves to live on in the way that the film that inspired it will. Inspiration is perhaps the best way of treating these 2 films. They start from the same place, but then they head off in completely different directions. Now this is where I want to go into that little bit more detail, so this is your big spoiler warning. If you have not seen these films, like the video, subscribe, put it in your watch later playlist, do whatever, go and watch them, and come back, I'll still be waiting. Okay, good, you've watched films now? Awesome, we can continue. I think to fully compare these 2 films we need to go that little bit deeper in, we need to dig into a couple of key little sequences. Mainly, I want to start at the start. Suspiria 77 is famous for having, well, in the words of Aregento, the film opens how most other horror films end, and I think this is incredibly fair. The film's opening from Susie arriving in Berlin to Patricia's death is so fantastic and so ridiculously intense. You have the weather, you have the score, you have all the colour, not to mention you have heart stabbings, you have death by hanging, you have death by falling stained glass windows. Intensity feels like an understatement, and it sets out so perfectly the film's stall for the rest of it. You know exactly what sort of film you are going to be watching. Everything that makes Suspiria great is in those first few moments. Well, 15 minutes. So then it feels really weird to say a scene of someone sat in an office is in any way comparable to that. But hear me out. Patricia's arrival at Klemperer's office is intense, just like the original, but it's internally intense. In the first shot we have protesters marching past, and once we go inside we've just got Chloe Grace Moretz going insane. Within moments she's singing, throwing her bag around, rocking on a chair and changing conversation at the drop of a hat. The audience and Klemperer are so bewildered. The intensity here is in mood, it is in performance, it is in the fact that we are attempting to understand this new world and the only person that understands it is babbling in the corner, not making any sense. But this sets up how we should feel for the rest of the film, exactly the same way as the original Suspiria does. It's just that the way the films are going to go is so completely different. Suspiria 77 is a fairy tale. It's Argento's Snow White. Its morality is the same as a fairy tale. It's so black and white. Susie is good, the witches are bad. Miss Tanner is Miss Trunchbull on acid. Madame Blanc is so incredibly aloof, and in the few moments that we get with Helena Markos, she sounds like she's having the asthma attack from hell. Notably, that really weird breathing is carried over into the original, but it's given to Susie's mom instead. I think that's a really interesting little part that they decided to keep. But once we step into the remake, everyone becomes morally grey, whether it's Susie or the witches. Even before we realise that Susie is the real Mother Suspiriorum, she's starting to change. She knows that something is wrong, or at least we can tell that, and you don't know whether she actually really cares. And it's the same with the divide between the witches, your Blankites and Marcosites, or whatever they're referred to in the film as. You get the sense that everyone thinks that they are right. And even when you're going deeper into characters, Madame Blanc seems nice, she seems friendly, but you see that she can lose a temper, and that comes out in the bit where they absolutely mess up Olga. Her emotions get the better of her, and this completely reflects the idea of a divided Berlin, where you have all of the Baader-Meinhof stuff going on, and the idea of doing bad things for what you see as a good cause. Intriguing that the further into the films we go, the more they begin to separate, the more they begin to diverge, the more it becomes clear what the purpose of each film is. I think this is really clear in both films' use of dance. Despite the original Suspiria being set in a ballet school, there is only really one scene of dancing, and it is terrible. It's just people spinning in a room. But that's because that's not what the film is about. The film is about, there is something very wrong here. People are being murdered. Who's got time to sit and watch people dancing? We need to watch people getting murdered. And that's fine, because that is what the film is about. We are watching that film for its spectacular violence, for its spectacular set design, for its score. We're not watching it because we were invested in the story or the characters particularly. Suspiria 2018 ties its narrative so closely to the dancing. Character comes through dancing. The plot is pushed along by learning more dances. The violence is always tied to dancing. Even the film's finale is built around dance, because you have that amazing ritual sequence. Aregento's finale is about putting the mystery to bed, stabbing the witch, and burning the whole school down. Whereas 2018 Suspiria is about understanding our characters finally, seeing who was right, and letting our characters go. Argento's film is all about having one last big, huge, explosive punch-up, basically. Guadagnino's film is about finally understanding everything that we've seen before. I think this is the key part. Guadagnino Suspiria isn't interested in anything that Suspiria got right originally. None of the key death sequences carry over into the remake. You know, we don't get the blind pianist being mauled by his dog. Although, notably, I do think his glasses turn up on Helena Marcos at the end. I think that's a nice little nod. Similarly, it doesn't do all of the colour. It doesn't do the big, huge soundtrack. It's so much more about picking up all the little details that Argento hasn't got time to deal with. It's about building an intriguing world. If someone put out a book explaining about who all the characters were and gave them a backstory, I would read it for the remake. I wouldn't care in the original. But that doesn't matter, because they're going after so many completely different things. They're perfect companion pieces because they perfectly complement one another. You have the big, loud, colourful film and the quiet, internal character drama. I just think there is room for both of these films. They are not an original and a remake in the way that so many of the slasher remakes we got are, where it's just the same film but with new people in it and better gore effects. These films are just perfect counterpoints. They both succeed where the other one falters, and that's to neither of their detriment. Both are amazing films. I love both of these films. I would happily watch either of them again, and I think there is room for them both to exist because they are so different and yet similar. I think the remake earns its title of Suspiria without ever trampling it over the original. I know Aregento doesn't like the remake, but I do think that's partly just because he was never going to. I think if this is what remakes were like all of the time, no one would ever complain about the fact that their favourite film was being remade, because it's just another way to enjoy the film. If anything, it is worth watching both. It was great to watch both of them in one week because they highlight the strengths of one another. Yes, they may point out the little weaknesses in one another, but they boost up everything that makes these films great. So do yourself a favour. Even if you didn't like this one, you can now get it in this country, by the way. I had to get it from Germany, but you can get it in England now. If you haven't watched either of them recently, watch them both again. Try and watch them in close proximity to one another. I wouldn't recommend doing it back to back because that'll take like 4 hours or something ridiculous, probably longer. But just watch them and enjoy them as their own, and watch how one highlights the other. Anyway, that's, I think, everything I have to say on either Suspiria film. Let me know in the comments what you think of either film. Would you like to see me compare more films like this? And like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on anything else. And I'll see you next time.